Hi, this is our group's presentation of social justice history discussion. My name is Rachel Acosta. In this group is myself, Caroline Krause, John D'Ignacio, and Kira Lyle, which everyone will be introducing themselves as they come up in the presentation. My portion is in the beginning, progressive librarianship before World War I. Now, to set the stage, in this time in our nation's history, a lot is happening. A lot of things are changing. It's after the Civil War. Blacks and other minorities are coming into the mainstream culture, and that means into libraries. Something that the Civil War did is it pushed women out of the home, and they find themselves also volunteering and eventually working in libraries. Also, we have a lot of disadvantaged populations that are coming into prominence in the culture in America. So non-Native, non-English speakers, Native Americans, the disabled, and the children's labor movement. I included this picture in here just because it stood out to me that it was from Newberry, South Carolina. As a reminder, that things were happening even here in South Carolina. So all these things socially are going on in our world as we talk about librarianship. And a quote that I wanted to bring in, and just to highlight these shifting tides, is that the library's labor disputes, it seeks to redress the social and political ills brought on by rapid industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. And it's also endeavoring to establish librarianship as a distinct profession. Before the progressive era, libraries were just seen as sort of repositories that only certain people would access. During the progressive era, those things sort of open up to the public. And so one of the big things that happens in this era, like I mentioned before, are women coming into the library as a volunteer, or eventually going through library school and becoming professional librarians. In this day and age, there were still a lot of entrenched social stereotypes about women. I included this picture of women there. It's not a picture of librarian women, but I brought it out because there was a corresponding movement of women clubs coming into existence and having a real prominence in the social world, and women's clubs wanting to enact change and help those around them. And that definitely falls into women coming into the library. Women librarians drew upon prevailing gender stereotypes and progressive ideals to carve out important positions within the library. And librarianship, like it says here, was seen as an appropriate place for women based on traditional norms. And something that happens in librarianship is that there's an expansion of services where, like I said before, the library was seen mostly as a repository. Now the library is seen as a place to serve all these varying populations that are coming out into society and interacting with each other. So some of the people that I wanted to highlight who started doing some of this work. So Gracia Countryman, she was in Minneapolis. And she started providing foreign language materials for immigrant workers who were in the area. She also procured Braille books for the blind. She set up distributing agencies that targeted all these disadvantaged populations, that targeted orphans, that was in jails, homes for the aged, hospitals, the poor. So this is really sort of a change in that expansion of library services to many different populations. Another woman that I wanted to highlight, Mary Wright Plummer. She's the second women president of the ALA. She also was the director of the Pratt Institute Free Library and founder of 2 library schools. This professionalization of librarians is a big deal because, like I said, they were trying to establish themselves as a field in of itself. She also pioneered, Mary Wright Plummer also pioneered children's services. She actually designed the first children's room, because if you think about if children labor laws are changing, where young kids would be going into the work world, now, the laws are saying that they can't go there. Well, where can they go? And one place that they can go comes to be the library, because they create spaces for children. So those are some people that I wanted to highlight, but there are also some cities and some different things going on around the country. So a city I wanted to highlight is in Boston. So they had this program called Saturday Evenings Girls Club. It's aimed at working girls from immigrant families. So these families would come over from mostly Europe, and the parents probably had varying degrees of language as far as English usage is concerned. As far as the fields that they were going into was definitely more labor. And so this Saturday Evening Girls Club targeted those girls, a part of those families, to try to give them some education, but also to Americanize them, to bring them into American culture. The three women who really headed this up, Edith Guerrero, Helen Osborne Storrow, and Edith Brown, were three of the main women, and they used a lot of women volunteers, but they themselves also, both Ediths were professional librarians. Something that they did is they taught the girls different skills. So there's the Paul Revere pottery, where the girls actually made pottery and then sold the pottery. But they would do lots of different skills. They tried to give them a lot of different skills, not just having book clubs and reading books, but to try and help them better themselves in the world. So sewing skills and things like that, so that they could try to move up in society. Another city that I wanted to highlight, Louisville, Kentucky. So Louisville, Kentucky, Thomas Blue is actually people who was the founders of the first full-service Black library in the country. It's called the Western Colored Branch, and it was established in 1905. And he started to extend and expand services for Black Americans through many different ways through his tenure. So in high schools, junior high schools, in depository stations, in classrooms. He also started one of the very first apprenticeship librarian classes specifically to train Black Americans to become professional librarians, because at that time, professional library schooling was only for whites. The other person I wanted to highlight, who is his co-founder, Albert Mazik, he was also in Louisville. He established the Eastern Colored Branch, and both of those branches, Western and Eastern, were housed in Carnegie financed facilities, which was a big deal at that time. There were no other Black libraries at that time that had that same funding. And here's a picture of the library. So this is a little bit later. This is in 1927. It is hard to find pictures older than the 1920s. But this is a picture of the main library desk at the Western Colored Branch in Louisville. Unfortunately, while so many things were going on, women are coming into the workforce, there's expansion of services, just like the title says, and justice is not for all, unfortunately. There are a lot of places, particularly in the South, but the South is not the only place. It was definitely all over the country where Blacks were really kept out of the library. And there were segregated libraries for many years. And so in Memphis, the government and the officials, the elected officials, wanted to keep the African-American vote. And so they would extend services at times to African-American populations to get them to vote for. But like this quote says, it was not in a way that would challenge white supremacy. In Atlanta, the same thing. After the Civil War in the South, particularly, there was just decimation as far as infrastructure. The Civil War really took a toll, particularly on Southern populations, of the men who were supposed to go back into the workforce who were never able to go back, either because they were killed in the Civil War or they were severely disabilitated because of their injuries. And so the South had a lot of rebuilding to do. So for many years after the Civil War, there was just not good services for anybody, Black or white, in the South. And then closer to the 1900s, some of those services started to come back, but it was primarily towards whites, and Blacks were definitely left out. And so even in Atlanta, you see a group of librarian women who do different things to reach out to the population in Atlanta. There is a woman who she procures bookshelves for a Black librarian, but obviously they're secondhand, they're not firsthand. And so there's just this overriding issue in the South of it. There just seems to be dissonance between librarians saying that we're progressive, that we're here for everybody, and yet at the same time not extending those same services to all patrons, that it's still from a segregated perspective of this library is only for whites and this library is only for Blacks. And so the institute that I just wanted to highlight, I just liked this picture. It's in Alabama, the Tuskegee Institute. This institute was for Blacks only, but they did have their own library. Even though it's not considered a public library, it's considered an academic library, they did serve the public. And so looking at the progressive era and looking at this time frame, while there were many services extended, while the library expanded and grew, women and children and disadvantaged and minorities coming into the library, there still is a tension between who the library is for and what the library does.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Caroline Krause. I'm pulling up my presentation right now. So my portion is about is post-war work, library activism during the 1950s and 1960s. Let's see. And so setting the stage for the 1950s, we are moving out of World War II, and during this time we are in the Cold War. So during this time there is the Red Scare. There's a lot of anti-communist sentiment and tension, and there's policing of who is a communist and what does a communist look like. So there's policing of morals, behavior, sexuality, and because of this, a lot of marginalized communities were targeted, were seen as communist, and in libraries, a lot of this literature was seen as communist. And so there's also the term lavender scare, which refers specifically to kind of the homophobia within the Red Scare and seeing gay people as a security threat. And in some cases, books about LGBTQ people were taken out of libraries. And even in the case of the Illinois State Library, there was sex ed books taken out as well. And so for this point, I wanted to bring up Jim Kepner. So Jim Kepner was a writer at One Magazine. One Incorporated, I think, was the organization as a whole's name, but they basically were an LGBTQ rights organization. And Kepner complained that he could not find anything within libraries in any collections that were relevant to LGBTQ people. And so he started to collect his own books. This was in the 1940s, but he kept collecting throughout the 50s and 60s. And at this time, he was inviting researchers into his New York apartment to do research and use his books. And so in this way, although he's not a trained librarian or archivist, he was providing a service that the library was not. And so I found this really important because in my presentation, I kind of want to focus on the profiles of people within or outside of libraries that were kind of grassroots efforts to help others. And also, as we see in the next couple of profiles, people who worked within libraries against the institution of librarianship, criticizing it to make it better. And so this way, Kepner, although he wasn't in librarianship directly, he did offer something outside of libraries as a library. And it later became an actual archive. He named it Western Gay Archives, and now it's housed at the University of South Carolina libraries. Or not South Carolina, Southern California. It's another USC. So anti-communist sentiments also bled into issues of civil rights. In the case of Ruth Brown, Brown was a librarian in Oklahoma she was fired, and they said it was for supposed communist ties, and also that was really because the library at the time was, I think, subscribed to some communist sympathizing magazines and publications. I will say that from some of the sources I saw that got her into trouble, some of those were really just Black literature and pro-integration literature kind of stuff. Excuse me. So I would say you can see there an overlap of the issues with regards to segregation and racism, which I'll talk about next. But also, a lot of people thought on that point that she was fired because she was very pro-integration. She served Black patrons, although at the time the libraries were segregated. She was a member of the Congress of Racial Equity and was actually once a part of a sit-in with 2 Black teachers at a restaurant. So her case garnered national attention, and the ALA and the ACLU, I believe, took her case, although she was not rehired. And so I think this example shows how within that policing of morals and behaviors and self-identification to weed out communist ties, there was also a veiling of they used anti-communism to perpetuate racism, and so the ALA actually did take a stance in 1953 by creating the Freedom to Read statement, and they basically said that it is essential for libraries to offer a wide variety of sources for everybody to read. However, libraries at the time were not integrated, or it was not all libraries were integrated, and segregation was a huge issue throughout the 50s and the 60s. However, ALA did ignore this topic for a long time, and as Eric Moon, who was the editor of Library Journal at the time, pointed out in his journal, he called it the silent subject, to how ALA was silent on this issue. And there was a shift because of Moon's work in library and information sciences discussions and thought, and within ALA, to shift the conversation just from censorship into equity of access with regards to segregation. And so in a 1950 editorial piece, Moon, like I said, criticized ALA, but also he posted or he shared an article written by a Black librarian about his experiences with regards to segregation. And after this, Moon continued to share stories of Black librarians and other librarians discussing their experiences with segregation in libraries, as well as just their disappointment with ALA as a whole. And soon after, or maybe not too soon after, but later ALA did amend the Library Bill of Rights to include that no one should be denied access to or the right to use libraries regarding their race. And so actually, Moon also posted at one point an article written by E.J. Josie. And so E.J. Josie was another librarian who was critical of ALA. In 1963, he criticized ALA for they were going to award a library journal in Mississippi an award, and he pointed out that this area is still not segregated, and so they're upholding segregation and ignoring it. And he's well known for, in 1964, at an ALA conference, Josie proposed that ALA should not allow membership of any ALA chapters that are still segregated. And so this passed, and I believe that the remaining libraries that were still segregated in ALA, at least in the South, I think that they integrated after this, or at least some of them. But so these are two examples of how individual work of both of these librarians challenging the structure of librarianship at the time, and a powerful organization, association that had a lot of influence over LIS and still does. They were able to help them shift the conversation. But I also wanted to point out an example of not librarians, but students who made a difference as well. And so in 1960, 8 South Carolinian students went to the Greenville Public Library and were asked to leave. And they came back later after consulting the issue with an NAACP leader in the area, and they decided to stay again and get arrested so that they would have more of a chance in court to argue their case and their side be understood and taken into account. And so the judge actually ruled that the library system had to integrate. And so this, although, again, like Jim Kepner, not any trained librarians or even library students, I believe, but a lot of sit-ins and protests at the time was really what it took for some libraries to integrate. And essentially the courts intervening is what made a lot of these Southern libraries integrate at the time. And so this is another example of whether or not they were within LIS. They were critiquing LIS in a sense and were able to change it for the better. And lastly, I want Augusta Baker. So Augusta Baker was a storyteller for the New York Public Library starting in 1953. Being a Black librarian and storyteller, Baker was discouraged by the lack of positive portrayals of Black characters in books that were for children. And so she did compile a bibliography of books that was published in 1957. She worked on this, I believe, throughout the 40s as well, but the, I believe, main edition was published in 1957. And so in 1961, Baker was hired as the children's coordinator for the New York Public Library. And this at the time was the highest office an African American had held at the time. And so I also wanted to note here that this kind of work around providing stories with positive portrayals influenced a lot of people, including Audre Lorde, who said that Baker was who got her to start reading, and credited her for, I believe she said once that Baker just made a very big impact on her life and totally changed the direction she was going in. So I think that's a great example of how, Baker was so influential at the time, and again was someone within librarianship that was I think taking a risk and pointing out the flaws in order to make collections better in this case. So yeah, all right.
Hello, I'm John DiGnazio, and my portion is to describe or present about the radical work in the 1960s and 70s, and or late 1960s, I would say, and how that affected libraries, or how librarians responded, and how the field of librarianship responded. Let me share my screen. Okay, so so I changed the order of the words from librarians revolting to revolting librarians, just for the easy comedic value, but also it's like to question whether, with the stereotype of librarians are not, like, you don't often see them as figures in revolt. Maybe personally they might be manning the ramparts, but you don't usually see them as the institution acting in that capacity. And so this, just by doing a little wordplay, that sort of provokes the question. So, like, because as the word institution implies, it's sort of like it moves, with budgets over time, with community ties. It's very sort of slow moving process and agent. And so when there's violent upheavals like we saw in the late 60s and 70s, what was the librarian's response? And as an academic, or academically minded, I sort of took maybe a more abstract kind of approach to this period, or how the field responded. So sorry about that, but I will try to present about it clearly. And so it'll be less heavy on sort of stories of people, and but more about kind of the dynamics that I see going on that I'm getting from particular sources. So, so the structure of this, at least my slides, is kind of complicated. Everything's complicated always. So I have these pictures sort of are representing, like, there's such a variety of social action and social justice movements during this period. And so, like, I'll have a picture on the right that's sort of targeting a particular movement with photo documentation. And then I'll sort of be talking on the left about a more sort of general sort of reaction to these different movements, to try to see, like, if there's a model that we can sort of understand that might be applicable to all these separate instances, and so we can sort of see how our field might, respond to them, or how we did respond to them, and maybe how we want to respond to such things in the future. So there's sort of this dynamic of the different kinds of librarianship, and so what's happening in academic libraries may influence what's happening in public libraries. That's generally sort of it's sort of a trickle down thing that people, at least the academic librarians, like to sort of maintain as always happening. So that's a question, because it's definitely about power and education level and resources. Academic libraries have lots of resources. There are many, but there are many more public libraries and public librarians, so they have a lot of power, a different kind of power. Anyway, so you can generally say that one type of the social actions that happened during this period were about minority rights and economic power. And so the picture is a photo of that was published in La Raza, which covered the Latino and Chicano movements of the 70s, and it was like a lot about just even saying there's Latinos and brown people here, and that we have a lot of we need rights, and we're being abused in farm fields. And so and this and then they demonstrated a lot in Los Angeles, and so all of this stuff was gathered together and put in it was gathered together by the publication, and then eventually that publication ended, and then the publication's archives went into the UCLA library, which is huge. So there's, as we've heard about, like, there's the field of librarianship is populated by professionals who are 85% women. So I saw the source that's written by Sarah Pritchard that was published in ACRL, which is the academic library research organ. And so she's a high figure in academic librarianship. She's active in ARL. She's the library director at Northwestern University in Chicago, which is, a powerful, rich private school in Chicago. And they have an amazing library that I've been to. But anyway, so she wrote this article about, women's studies, about how librarianship, or sort of an academic librarianship, responded to women's studies. And so, but like it's a great model. And so I sort of generalized it to think about how it could be for like sort of every social movement, and how, librarianship can sort of help the academy, or how the librarianship does help the academy, set up new fields of study and look at new dynamics in our society. So in phase one, she quotes two women's studies scholars with this sort of. There's actually 5 phases, but I couldn't understand the 5th one. But the 4 phases that were clear were these 4, where there's this existing set of scholarship that sort of ignores, in the case of the articles, ignores that women even exist in society and have any agency, or have contributed. And so the first step is you recognize, oh, like women were players. And so how do we even go back and like sort of look at them? There's been so ignored in all of the literature and all the resources. So how do we recognize that this is even a thing, that people have been made invisible, and how do we overcome it? So then phase 2 becomes compensatory scholarship. So it's all these sort of set of published resources, and then the catalogs and collections that neglect and make people invisible. But now you recognize that that's a factor of invisibility, and so you've gone back to all these old sources and old catalogs, and you're looking for any sort of sign for people that they might have existed and made a contribution. And I can say that this is valid because I did this internship at the American Craft Council, and only 1% of their collection targets the crafts of indigenous craftspeople. So but we all know that indigenous people make crafts. So now I have to go to the giant collection that represents the American Craft Council and look for any sorts of sort of undercover coverage of actually indigenous people and indigenous crafts people. And so that's going to be hard. Anyway, so the phase 3 is where you address anomalies and absences in history and scholarship, and that results in energetic response with new information resources. So it's like you start to have like organizations that in academia and scholars who are dedicated to a field, and they're like so they're really researching this, and they're generating papers, and they have journals. And so the library then responds by actually buying these materials, and covering conferences, and building that into the classification schemes that we maintain, and with and then thus recording all the purchases and making things findable and shareable and disseminatable. So phase 4 is where you have this sort of body of scholarship operating in the library and in the academy, and so then there's all these secondary effects of oh my God, people, women have made all these impacts, or the Chicano, Latin American people, were in this country before we were a country, and they've, had a sizable influence on our culture, and some of the ways that we think are because of the contributions of Latino and Chicano people, not just as farm workers. So it becomes much richer and more complex and sort of stimulating. So, and plus they own it. It's not like we're giving them anything. They have power, they're demanding things, and we're listening to them. And so our sense of diversity is bigger and greater. So then we have, so there's this confluence, some of these things are overlapping. So we have women's actions both for themselves to drive feminism, and we have them striking for as part of the anti-Vietnam War efforts. So so we can sort of see that we can sort of examine that 4 phases in terms of the women's studies programs to address sort of the invisibility of women in the academy here before that. And so so the first women's studies programs that academic libraries had to sort of recognize, were established in 1970 and then proliferated rapidly throughout the 70s. And then they were generating primary sources, so, which librarians have to pay attention to and, create, they notice and then they attend conferences and you have to be aware of your community and have buying programs that, buy books and get to know certain publishers and get to know all the newsletters and the manifestos. So these are all primary sources of people actually generating this content, this new kind of content. And so then that leads to secondary sources. That's our job as infrastructure, little agents. We're, tooling away and collecting, and we're building our bibliographies and, sort of creating our own primary source documents about the other primary source documents. And then we just even identifying who are these primary sources, who are the authors who are creating this content. So you need to know that when you're building reference services. So who, it needs to get timelines of people and, how they're related to each other and who did what when. And so then, we have library guides about this field, these new emergent fields, and anthologies of, where we do snippets of larger works. So it's all all about information resources, which I love. So then we have this is about the gays and lesbians and their actions to say that they exist in society, not be ignored, because there's this whole thing about passing. So it was all about whether you could pass and whether you could sort of have your federal job and not get caught out, or be a public school teacher and be gay and not be caught out. But if you went to the bar and you were arrested, then it was this whole thing of you could be blackmailed, because then you could lose your job or be shamed by your family and lose your inheritance and all this stuff. So it was this, by the Stonewall riot was huge, because it was we're not going to take this garbage anymore, because the mafia ran the bar and could extort anybody at any time by taking their picture, and they'd serve them crappy drinks, and it was just it sucks to be a second-class citizen. So you're at everyone's mercy. So this was them saying, we're not going to take this garbage anymore, and there was a riot. And so that was in New York, but so I looked at what was happening in Philly, because I lived there for a time, and I knew people who worked at the William Way Community Center and did their cataloging. And so, so we could look at in terms of the phases, there's two kinds of movements. There's the radical movement, which is the grassroots, up from the ground space. And so, it's people just acting out and, doing things and collecting, as Caroline said, collecting things in their closets in their living rooms and inviting people over. And so gradually that stuff gets pulled in, into larger sort of civic structures. And maybe the library participates in that, or maybe new people kind of come in and make a library, and then but then that's sort of gathered up by the real library. And so that's the mainstream approach, is so then you have this social movement, and then you have government commissions and national organizations and activists who participate in public debates. And so they become figures that are known and are about raising this issue in sort of genius ways. And so that's part of the mainstream then. Whereas there was this fringe happening that nobody really wanted to pay attention to, and now this is sort of becoming a legitimate sort of social movement. And so those are the things which I loved. So there's this story of Barbara Giddings. She participated in the social reaction research roundtable, at ALA. Social Resource Roundtable. And so she was in that group, which formed in 1970. And then out of that came this gay-oriented group, which was another roundtable eventually that came out of the social research. And so she was in it all along, and so she was collecting all these materials, and then eventually her entire giant collection, which is larger than anything other than what's in San Francisco, became part of the Free Library in Philadelphia. So we can see this sort of tension between radical and mainstream sort of collections and actions. So I like this sort of thing about so this is generally, we can generalize this whole process as being that we can sort of look at and think about, that's we're doing in this class. And so how is this all happening? Is this really a direction we want to go? How is our field responding? Are we doing it well? Are we doing it not well? Are we hiding things? Are we playing to power bases? Or are we provoking needed change and serving more people? And so how we do that is by sort of understanding that we're engaged in critical librarianship. And to do that, it means that you have an epistemological stance, which means that you're questioning your beliefs, your actions in terms of different beliefs. And then you're self-reflective about like, well, you know, who is this library director? Am I a library director? What am I doing? Who am I helping? Where does my money come from? How does that serve my community? And then you're going to actively, you know, I'm going to be a community agent. I'm going to help out people who are disenfranchised and make sure that our institution serves them as best as they can. And then, yeah, just like, are we doing this consciously or unconsciously? If you're being a critical librarian, you're doing it consciously. And yeah, I'm sorry. So the SRRT, I butchered that. It's Social Responsibilities Roundtable. And so that happened in 1969. And then, you know, it becomes this sort of whole Progressive Librarians Guild, which formed in 1990. So that shades to exciting things in the future. Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, I'm gonna take over. Give me 1 second. So I'm Kira Lyle, and I'm going to take us into the 90s and beyond. 1 second. Here we go. Dun, 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 dun. It's thinking. Okay. So the 90s is a moment of transformation, from an industrial society to an information society. So this is similar in a way to what Rachel was discussing in the progressive era, where we saw a transformation from an agricultural society to an industrial society and what that kind of caused. So now we're looking at another paradigm shift from industrial to information. So this begins prior to the 90s, of course, but for the general public, the realities of the shift are increasingly felt beginning in the 80s and moving into the 90s and the 2000s. So this is a technological shift, of course, but it's also an economic transformation, right? So to quote Henry Blank, he says, if capital and labor are the major structural features of industrial society, information and knowledge are those of the post-industrial society. Information is now a commodity. It is something to be bought and sold. And so how does this affect libraries? How do libraries respond to a world in which information is a commodity? Because if information is a commodity, it suddenly seems that libraries are brought into the marketplace. Peter Young stated in an extreme, an either or case, the library provides services that constitute a public good or information as a commodity. Of course, it's not that simple, but this is now something that libraries have to contend with and where they fit in this new economic system. So not only is information framed as a commodity, but also technology is expensive to implement. And so it starts a free or fee conversation among librarians about how to offer the best services to people, how to offer resources to people. And it causes librarians to question the values of their profession and how to achieve the public good. And if we need to redefine what the public good means and how librarians relate to and serve the public. Another paradigm shift, which is occurring that librarians have to contend with, is framed around population and demographics. And much of this conversation in the literature is framed as an optics issue, that our reference desks and the people behind them don't match our communities, and this is a problem. So there is recognition, institutional recognition, that there is a scarcity of librarians of color in LIS education and in the field. And this creates a foundation of institutional initiatives in the late 80s, moving into the 90s. There are initiatives, task forces, committees, and they are largely focused on recruitment, and representation becomes a solution for systemic white privilege, or it's framed that way. So an absence is noted, and representation rather than analysis becomes the solution. And this is a picture of Lorna Peterson. She's at SUNY Buffalo, and there's a quote of hers that I really, I think it's amazing. But it's related to these conversations about like ratios that in the year 2000, that the population will be half minority or half immigrant. And this is something that libraries have to contend with, and that it is necessary. It then becomes necessary to correspond to the ratio of the population in libraries. That if our community is half minority, then our librarian should be half minority, and that this kind of like mathematical solution will somehow solve resource and service inequality. So in response to this kind of idea, Lorna Peterson says, the truth is there is conflicting demographic evidence that by the year 2000, the nation will be 33 1/3% minority. And even if it is, what of it? History shows that it is not numbers that dictate the distribution of resources and power. Multiculturalism obscures equity issues. So this kind of multicultural conversation, this celebration of differences, doesn't solve inequality. Like, we need analysis of why resources go where they go, and why librarians of color that enter the field feel unwelcome, or why they don't enroll at all. And so, to Lorna Peterson's point that multiculturalism limits the discourse about inequality, this is echoed by other librarians and other scholars at the time. So this first quote is from Amy Sunny, and she says, that multiculturalism, it has the potential to hide more than it reveals, and that multiculturalism conversations are focused on creating more tolerant individuals rather than more equitable institutions. That if somehow people can just all get along, then our library resources and services will be more equitable. Multiculturalism is also a really nebulous term. It is arguably a way of avoiding race and other kind of identifiers. So this is a quote from Christine Pauley, and she says, the various dimensions of multiculturalism, including race, ethnicity, class, and gender, have different histories and different theoretical explanations. And when we collapse them all into each other, we really do a disservice to any kind of analysis. And in fact, Lorna Peterson, in the article that I quoted from, goes on to argue that even kind of phrasing like people of color and collapsing all non-white races into the same category also kind of prevents analysis. Todd Hanma, in his article Tripping Over the Color Line, says, with the incorporation of multicultural discourse came the renewed danger of and promoting a celebratory rhetoric around cultural difference. So this kind of like celebration of diversity with no analysis of what that term even means. And I think that this sentiment kind of remains with us today. That in the 90s, we see, as Caroline mentioned, there was criticism in the 50s and 60s that the ALA that race was, I wrote it down, so it was a good quote, the silent subject, right? And so in the 90s, we have institutional notice that our field is really white and that that's a problem, but this kind of language of celebratory diversity and multiculturalism, it's nebulous, it's ill-defined, and there's no analysis of the particular ways that people are oppressed. Also, as I've presented here, there's kind of this false dichotomy that arises in libraries, that technology is something that has to be dealt with in the here and now, but racism, we can ignore it or it will work itself out, or even more insidiously, that somehow racism will be solved by incorporating diverse librarians in the same way that we incorporate computers into our libraries. And the level of analysis is the same there. Like there really isn't any. And so in 2006, when Christine Pauley publishes her piece, which if we're looking at the 90s, she kind of has some hindsight about the 90s in the same way that we can have hindsight about her work in 2016. And she says that race needs to be prioritized as a matter of urgency in the same way that technology was in the 90s and forward. And so that kind of takes us into today and also into our discussion.
As we're about to discuss, I am really quickly going to share my screen and make sure, after I presented, I wasn't sure if I made sure my citations were up on the screen. So I'm going to do that really quick as we're starting.
I need to do the same thing.
Did you grab the screen before me? Or no?
No, I realized it right as I closed.
Yeah, I think I just flashed mine, I think.
Yeah, I did as well.
Yeah.
Let's see. Well,
so are we? So we're nearing 45 minutes. Is that right?
We started at 2:40, so we're at 40 minutes or 50 minutes now.
Okay.
Okay. So those were my sources for the 50s and 60s, and it's not letting me stop sharing. If you'll try, is it letting you to share, Rachel? If you just try.
You
I'm not sure.
There you go.
Okay.
Mine's
awesome.
taken. So those are my references for my portion.
Shall we start the discussion?
Yes. Who wants
Sure.
to lead off?
Does anybody want to go first? Because I have one.
Go, Kira. Go.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about like race and institutional initiatives. So something that I noticed in particular with mine and Caroline, but also kind of across the board, is that so in the progressive era, we see that there was still segregation despite offering services to other disenfranchised people. And then, as Caroline stated, we have race as the silent subject in the ALA. There's obviously a lot of discussion about racial movements in John, your section. So I just wanted to talk about how we kind of go from segregation to race as a silent subject to institutional recognition, and if that is progress, and if anything, if institutional initiatives are progress, and how you guys kind of see that.
You go ahead.
I was going to say, it's funny that you asked that question because this morning, Caroline and I were testing some things and we were kind of talking about how there can be sort of institutional amnesia at times where something that was a problem, all of a sudden over the years, it's like, oh, it's not a problem anymore. And, you know, thinking back to like what you were saying, like in the progressive era, there's this push for services for minorities and particularly for Black Americans because they're not receiving services in white libraries. And then, you know, just 70 years later, you know, because my era ended around the 1910, 1920s, 70 years later, all of a sudden it's, oh, there's no problem anymore, or numbers will just solve it. And it seems like there just seems to be an avoidance of really talking about what's going on. You know, that while time does heal many things, there are things that need to be pushed and still talked about. And, you know, so I think it's interesting that while there has been a lot of progression and there has been a lot of things that have changed, at the same time, like what optically things have changed a lot, but in practice, I think there's still a lot of work to be done that people aren't talking about, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I sort of forgot to make the point that I mean, so whether librarians are seen as sort of change agents or not, like I would say they're not generally, but like that, but like if you go to an ALA, there's a lot of conversation happening, and we're like very, like if you meet a librarian, like as we're all kind of librarians, but like I've always thought it's intriguing that like if you meet us if you look at us, we're like sort of vanilla, but then if you start talking to us, we're like these sort of change agents, and we're very socially engaged. And that sort of is reflected generally when you go to an ALA. And so like that, like, and the rest of the society doesn't really see us, you know, we're all like sort of quiet and mousy. But then when you go to an ALA, it's this like hotbed of like seething activity and social dynamics. So it's like, it's just a weird dichotomy. And it's like, it's how we change, I think, is like we have this sort of external appearance of no change, but then there's sort of like these sort of seething undercurrents and these waves of change that happen through ALA. Or not.
Yeah. And I would say, you know, what I really learned through my research, and I kind of tried to bring that into my presentation as well, is like a failure of institutional change and a success of individual change, or individuals pressuring institutions into change that then kind of make the situation better, I guess, within librarianship. And even then, it's not perfect. And so we see examples of people having to work outside of librarianship or do their own work, you know, like Baker compiling the bibliography, even though she was within librarianship as a librarian and storyteller. She had to do her own personal work in order to make real change so that students or patrons can see themselves reflected positively in literature and make that connection with reading, as happened with Lord, talking about her experience there. And so, and really that gets to kind of one of my questions, a general question with regards to, and I guess this is similar to what you were saying, but in general, within y'all's research, I was interested to see how you felt about institutional change, if you felt that institutional change came of its own, or if it was pressuring people from outside, pressuring institutional change. Because with regards to mine, even if we see other institutions coming in and intervening with regards to like the court cases with sit-ins and protests, that still happened because of the sit-ins and protests that have happened because of individual work and change. And that was calculated with regards to them, the Greenville A asking the NAACP members for their thoughts. They went back with the intention of being arrested to be able to have the institutional change. So this is kind of similar to Kira's, and y'all might have might not have a lot more to say about institutional versus institutional change, but I was wondering if y'all saw similar themes without yours, because that, I think that was my biggest theme that I saw throughout the decades.
So yes, definitely, for sure. So I read a lot in mine about, I think really what it comes from is something that we have talked about in class a lot, that, and I think we definitely see the origins of this in the progressive era, as Rachel talked about, where like libraries are these virtuous, good institutions for the public. And so I think that, I mean, for a profession that really is kind of based around language, like language is important, and we should recognize this. And this comes from the like happy diversity talk and the happy multiculturalism talk, and that we are virtuous, good institutions. And so we still have to frame our language as accepting, even when it has not been in the past, and we're actively trying to correct a kind of limitation. So I read, this is from a law librarian named Joan Howland, but she's writing in 1998. And so she's talking about the American Association of Law Libraries. And she says that in 1998, the AALL has articulated in its most recent strategic plan a commitment to foster diversity, broadly defined to include gender, race, and sexual orientation among membership and leadership of the association. And so Joan Howland says that this is great, and it reflects like sensitivity to diversity concerns. But she says, as with the policy adopted in 1975, it stopped short of voicing a commitment to condemning racism. And I think it's that like stopping short of actively saying we are anti-racist, that kind of language. And instead it's the like we support diversity. But where is that? Because even in the 90s in law libraries, again, this is from the Joan Howland, but she says that from 1979 to 1996, the number of non-white graduating librarians, like that number drops. So it's like these institutional, the recognition of like, oh, we can talk about race now. It's like, well, what is the actual gain that we're seeing? Because the problem is still there aren't enough non-white librarians and we're not serving our communities. So this like lack of explicit recognition of the past of the field is a problem, and it's not being solved.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like we can be so narrow. It's like if society's like forcing us to be so pressurized and sort of stand back on our feet, then we can be ever more sort of circular and insular about what we do and what's legitimate for us to do. And then so then we have this thing that we're virtuous good. But like my thing is like, as a designer, I'm like, let's be chaotic good, like librarians, like why don't we look at for a broader range that's, with technology or not technology, like people are making libraries and publishing resources, and it's our job to get in there and collect a wider version of that. And we can be critical about that. So I don't know. That's my thoughts.
Actually, do you know what? If I can just add one thing really quick, something I just thought of while you were talking is, I think this is something that I saw in the 90s where the focus is more on like, we need to look at our library schools and we need to look at who librarians are rather than who our public is. And so I think that, oh my gosh, I just lost the thought. But I think that with these institutions, it's like we need to focus more on who our librarians are and how we're supporting our librarians rather than just like the public, if that makes sense.
And I think what I saw is that's because the profession was under threat, because with technology, like it's all this question of like who needs a library if everything's on Google, and and so everybody's like, oh, we have to really focus on what a librarian does, and so they were really forced into this sort of conservative, navel-gazing posture to defend their legitimacy, and I think that's like when I came to the field that was happening, and to me as a journalist, like I've seen a lot of things, and that's like the worst response you could possibly do, because everybody's like, if you're going to be all defensive about it, then people are going to be like, I don't want to talk to you, instead of just showing your value, like, and getting in their space and being like, I can help you out here.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I referenced this in my portion that at the turn of the century there was this idea of like, what is a librarian? Who are we and what do we do? Especially because, who is being serviced is expanding, right?
In such a good way, yeah. In such a good
way. In a great way. And then also this professionalization of the field, so there's library schools popping up all over the place, and then women being able to go into those fields and it being seen as, that's a good place for you to work. And then it just seems like constantly over and over again, Kira, going to your point of, in the 90s, we're having that conversation again of like, what is a librarian? Who are they? What are they servicing? And this conversation seems to detract from, also who are the people, what I mean, out there? Who are we trying to get? Like, we're not just trying to give librarians like a legitimate field, but we're trying to serve the public as well, and not just differentiate ourselves from another field. And so, I think for me, thinking about and like listening to everybody, it just feels like the question that keeps being kicked downstream is the whole idea of the domination of white supremacy, and how we come
the thing
out
that does not change.
right, like what I said before, like the services a lot of times in the South during the progressive era, there were services provided to Black Americans and to minority groups, but it was never really at the challenge of white supremacy. It was sort of like under the umbrella of white supremacy. And so the whole idea of separate but equal, but we all know that it wasn't equal as far as quality is concerned. Black libraries had secondhand books. They didn't have as good reference materials. They didn't have as good facilities, all those different things. And it feels like there are individuals that are sort of pushing against white supremacy. And sometimes they team up as a group, where they kind of team up together and they try to push against white supremacy. But it seems like even in the 90s, we're still having this problem of there's this umbrella of white supremacy, and how do we continue to push against that? And at times, like what Caroline, what you were referencing, at times it's legislative and there's legislation pushing against white supremacy. And then at other times it's individuals, and they have to kind of work together. But there always seems to be this pushback, you know what I mean? Of, so we can't have a library that's segregated, but then there are individuals within that say they come up with new ways to sort of keep people out of the library.
Well, I mean, and plus, like, our collections are conservative instruments, right? So it's like we judge ourselves by our collections, and how their historical reach, their subject breadth, but it's all based on, this paradigm that's been going on for, hundreds of years. I mean, and that excludes people's voices, and and so it just no library wants to burn down their collection and start all over again,
Right.
I mean, that's yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thinking about like white supremacy, I think I brought up the term like analysis, like there needs to be analysis of libraries. And so what people like Lorna Peterson and Todd Hanmar are saying is that like the library needs to stop being treated as like this ahistorical kind of out of context institution. Like libraries have existed over time. We just did like 100 years. But throughout that entire time, we've seen that like libraries have been instruments of white supremacy. And so in the 90s, what Lorna Peterson says, is that the solution to this is scholarship, theory, and analysis. And so the library itself needs to be a subject. And if we can do that work, especially if we can bring in scholars to our library schools who focus on like racism and analyzing the library itself, that is something that will be really helpful to prevent the library from still being this like a historical institution, which in being a historical supports white supremacy.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
I think,
that echoed I just want to say that echoed my critical librarianship thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to say, thinking through what we're talking about right now, I see one conversation we're having kind of about the whiteness within libraries and white supremacy is the arguments about neutrality and like whether or not we're neutral or not. And I kind of see that reflected. Yeah, I see that reflected in like the 60s with the Moon coining ALAs, ignoring the segregation at the time, the silent subject. I feel like, and that's the thing is like looking back, I can say that was very obviously like that neutrality for them at that time of just ignoring segregation was like very, very racist and totally upholding white supremacy. And now we're seeing conversations about whether or not libraries should be taking on the stance of like Black Lives Matter, which I would argue has a history from the 60s. That movement has a history from the 60s. So just wanted to throw that out there, something that I was thinking about during this conversation.
Yeah, and Kira, like that goes with your technology in libraries. Like it's like there's this thing of like technology is good. Like librarians are not challenging whether technology is good.
Yeah,
it's not critical.
Well, this goes into the question that I have is libraries are now thought of as for all people. So like in my era, libraries weren't necessarily for all people, and there's like these individual places pushing libraries for all people. But in general, we think of segregation as a thing of the past, right? Well, there's been all this legislation and now segregation is not a thing. But my question is, in what ways are people still kept from libraries?
Well, I think especially with like the integration of technology, what librarians have to deal with is that there's this idea that not only is technology good, but it can be ubiquitous, and that it means that everyone can have access to everything. And what we see is, surprise, surprise, things that kept people from resources and services before, like racism and class and like socioeconomic status, also keep people from technology. And even if the library can have computers, it's like, well, do we charge people for computers? How do we build these like databases? What institutions are we going to partner with? Who are we going to allow access? Will there be paywalls? All of these questions show that like even technology, which is kind of posited as something that will bring information to everyone, finally, that we'll all have like the information superhighway, beep, beep. It's not so.
Something I've actually been thinking about recently with regards to white supremacy within libraries and like in that way equity of access and kind of what you're getting at, Rachel, is considering the rules within libraries actually. And this doesn't really have to do with my presentation, but I just have been thinking about there are unspoken rules even about like dress, and sometimes those are written down, like dress codes kind of. I've heard of people being kicked out for wearing certain things or not wearing certain things. Loud voices, just the way you move within the libraries. And so I don't have a lot to like bring behind that because this isn't something I've been researching, but that is something that really interests me. I've been thinking about it a lot recently with regards to whiteness within the library, how we're making rules about how you can exist within the library kind of makes me question that. And then also just another brief thing that I haven't really researched, but that my research for this made me think of was the positioning of libraries within the community. So like where they literally are, where they are built, and how people can get to them. And I'm wondering how what that looks like now, because I know in the 60s, whenever people were thinking about integrating, in one of my sources, they were talking about how if they shut down the African American only branch, then that was closest to their communities, and the white main central branch was far away and harder to get to. So I think that's another thing to think about.
So I had a question. Is my turn for a question? So
Sure.
how does it, having done this and listening to each other, it's been a great experience for me, but how has it changed how you want to be a librarian?
Ooh, we love a reflection.
I think it's made me way more aware of my language, the way I speak, aware of other people's language. I think, to your point, Kira, that we are not ahistorical people and we are not a part of ahistorical institutions, that there is a history and it has repercussions and effects. You know, a small example is that when my grandmother, she's 93, but when my grandmother was born in 1927, and so, you know, she grew up at a time where she was sort of nickel and diming everything, you know, and that followed her very late into her life. She no longer really does a lot of laundry, but when her and my grandfather lived in their condo, it was like she couldn't help herself when she saw laundry detergent on sale and it was like a 2-for-1 or something. She had to get it. So for like the first several years of my marriage, I'd never had to buy laundry detergent because my grandmother was always giving me like her extra laundry detergent. But it was like she had this mindset of scarcity, like this may not be available at some time, or I may not have the money available to have this at some time. So I need to get this now in case this resource goes away. And that lasted through her 80s. And she's still alive now, but like I said, she's living in a place where she doesn't have to do as much laundry. And just seeing even in one person's life, like those formative years and the way she grew up and how long it stayed with her. So how much more institutions, how much more a collective group of people, like if a history has happened to a collective group of people, that doesn't just go away after one generation. It takes time, it takes many generations. And if I'm not affected by that history and I just ignore that, you know, as part of that collective group, like I'm participating in something. I'm participating, whether I'm conscious of it or not, I'm participating in wiping the slate of history in a bad way. And so I think like it's really made me realize my positionality, you know, and that I have to be very cognizant of what I recognize and being proactive about that.
Yeah, for me, I feel like it's made me consider kind of, like I've said, my whole kind of thing within my presentation and everything is looking at how we're how individuals being critical of the institution they're a part of, or that is supposed to serve them and maybe is not. How we can change the institution in some way, or whether or not we're able to push it far enough to make it better. We can make our own change in our own way, whether or not we're working within or without the institution. And so for me, in that way, it's really challenged me to consider like how I can take what I've learned from this and what I've learned from our class, all of the concepts, and actually use them. And so like one thing was, I think 2 or 3 of my examples within my presentation is about storytelling, which we've talked about in the class with Dr. Cook's article. And I think one or 2 more articles and chapters we've read. And that was something that I very much, it's something that I I think I mentioned in an organization I was in, we were trained for storytelling in a way to tell our story to get more people on board with what we were doing. And so in that way, I have some experience with it, but it was really hard for me to think about when and where can I be using this within my practice. And I know Tyler in one of his Flipgrids actually was talking about bringing this into his practice. And so like really thinking about like, what would this look like now as opposed to then? Would we use it to speak out against this institution, or could we train our patrons to speak out against another institution or against some other kind of overarching story that is not representing them accurately? Things like that. It's challenging me to bring this all home and actually like practice it rather than just hear it and talk about it on these forums.
I think for me, John, to some of the points that you've made, like I do think of myself as like a cool radical librarian. Like I have cool glasses and I have a nose ring. Like I love radical metadata. Like these are the ways that I think about myself and my work. And so especially from reading about like the 90s and like, oh, now there's institutional recognition that our field is too white and we should do something about it. For me, I think something that I have realized that I now need to implement as like a working professional is like, because I am a white woman and have that power in these spaces, like when I'm looking for jobs and when I'm looking at institutions, like to ask those questions about like, well, what is your policy on like anti-racism work, to look at the who is the leadership of the library, who is working in the library. If it's me and like 8 other white ladies, that's a problem. And that I have that power to not just think about my own work and how my own work can be radical, but how I can question and critique institutions. And I think that's something that I need to take forward from this.
For me, I think what you guys all have done that is a strength that I maybe have neglected for whatever reason, and that actually it's something that Nicole also, or Professor Cook also does, is that you guys are very specific about people, and I sort of overgeneralize, but like you bring in specific stories about specific people and specific times, and that it just makes things more concrete and like real to me. And so I'm going to try to do that in the future.
Cool.